How many students are here? How many people here are students at one of the schools? Let's put your hands up here, okay? So, somebody here must have a question who's a student for this man. You know.
I think we have someone who wants to ask the first question already.
Yeah, he's a student. I know that.
And the second part of it is a little bit more directed toward Paul. It has to do with your fifth question that you put to Paul, which is about the future of the role of liberation theology in medicine. Please recall, and you mentioned this, David, that liberation theology was attacked not just by the Vatican, but it was attacked by the Vatican. People were silenced, people were excommunicated. Yes. It was also attacked by the elites in Latin America, including the military, and by the United States foreign policy establishment, which explicitly noted this as a danger to American interests in Latin America, in the Rockefeller Report, for example, after he went down and visited. So here we have perhaps a rebirth of a movement that many people had written the obituary for. Liberation theology. It was dead and gone. And now, thank God, with Pope Francis, who was greatly influenced by this, and you can tell this by his first pastoral statement, and by many of the things that he's doing and saying, we have that. We have this book, we have this conversation, and it gives me a little hope that maybe those obituaries were a little premature. So I wanted to get your speculation on that. Is surely these people who are endangered, who feel themselves endangered by liberation theology, are going to feel themselves endangered by its rebirth as well, because it still poses a serious threat to many of the things they hold dear. Now, my question for you, Paul, is a little shorter, which is the underlying principle of liberation theology, the preferential option for the poor, meant that you started in theology. You started reading again. Theology, Bible, church, ethics, all those things, from the perspective of the poor, the outsiders, the people who had not been part of this conversation, who hadn't been listened to. We had done the theology and brought it to them as a message. Now, I wanted to ask you to imagine a little bit, and you've hinted to this in a couple of things you've said this evening. What about the poor actually making an input into, let's say, medical education, or what the practice of medicine is about, or global medicine is? Can you imagine how it might change if it weren't just a service being brought to the poor, but by those people being enlisted in the agenda and in the perspective of the whole medical work? Thank you very much again, and I hope we hear more from both of you this evening and in the future.
Deep questions.
Real quickly, just it's great to have Harvey Cox here. I don't know if any of you recently saw, he wrote an article answering his own question in The Nation. And it's absolutely, I learned a lot from that article. He went to Rome, got a chance to talk with people there, and has really deciphered, as much as anybody in the world, the whole history of liberation theology, its ups and downs, and has now been able to see that we are at a time of sort of, tantalizing hope here. Part of the problem is, of course, that Rome and the papacy, they have such influence over the way the Catholic community, as in large, embraces these theological innovations, these theological statements. I mean, the Catholic tradition has been here how long? 1,500 years? You'd think that liberation theology would have been here at least 1,000 years ago, and not seen in the 1970s as some sort of danger. Actually, Paul's on top of this because here in note 6, in a terrific chapter he writes called Health, Healing, and Social Justice, he picks this up. Let me read it to you. there are other clues that liberation theology might have something to offer the healing professions. For one, the more destructive forces hate it. In 1982, for example, advisors to U.S. President Ronald Reagan argued that, quote, American foreign policy must begin to counterattack and not just react against liberation theology. That's quoted from the Santa Fe document, a Reagan administration working paper. So you get a sense of why I'm asking Paul that second question. I think this is such a remarkable partnership that he and Gustavo Gutierrez has formed. But we've got to give Paul a lot of credit here, because he's got this other chapter in here that really lays out a way to make liberation theology a kind of guide for new types of innovations, both in theology but also in medical treatment. He's got a chapter here, Conversion in the Time of Cholera, a reflection on structural violence and social change. But he's also got this other chapter with the subtitle is Insights from Liberation Theology. You know, you wouldn't even have theologians writing that, you see, except for some of the people, as I say, Elizabeth Schussler-Fiorenza and Harvey Cox and people like that. This is a great moment, and I'm very grateful to be sharing it with you.
Thank you, David. And Harvey, let me just say before I turn to the second question that it won't surprise you to learn, again, it's not the most comfortable topic to discuss, although I've tried to write about it. It won't surprise you to learn that being drawn to liberation theology in a country where a dictatorship was being unseated by it, and to some extent, led to a certain familiarity with the impact, the reactionary forces that you mentioned, and to knowing people who were killed in those years in Haiti. And there were some spectacular crimes against the church, the Liberation Church in Haiti, as you know. And so I'm also very interested in preventing or not seeing, not that I would give myself any capacity to prevent, but to never seeing that again. And you know, it's an Enlightenment idea, but not a bad one, that laying out, again, the utility of these ideas for doing good in the world is not only, as David said, exactly what is called for, obviously, enough, 1,500 years ago and more, but something that one has to, at least I have to believe. You could say, well, wait a second, why would you not want to do these things? Make a preferential option for the poor, making, to understand structural violence and to practice accompaniment. And I know the answer. I once said to my friend, the theologian, who by the way tells me that Christianity, all the good stuff happened in the first 400 years. But asking, well, why would someone want to hurt a liberation theologian? And she looked at me like, are you kidding? Don't you remember Jesus? Anyway, back to the second question. Partners in Health, and many of our partners, have in fact permitted just that, to bring people living in poverty, who still call themselves the poor, into our work, and also to listen to their lived experience of poverty and illness, to change the work further, to change the work plans and the budgets, back to the word that comes up all the time in our work, right? And I was lucky enough to be able to give some examples in there. That is, when something fails the poor, instead of calling it the failure of the poor to comply or adhere to the way we, let's say, prescribe a medicine or offer a service, how about we ask them what we did wrong in serving them or failing to serve them? And I'd say those two parts of the work, again, which can be laid out in great detail, how we structure certain programs. You know, I'm talking about clinical programs to serve the poor, how we understand the importance of removing barriers to good health, which, you know, we've called these barriers structural violence. A friend of mine who's a surgeon is here in the room, in the church tonight, and you know, even in the operating room, what we found is that for patients to get well after a procedure, we needed to pay attention to the experience of poverty on either preventing them from getting to us in time or preventing them from following some important prescription, quite literally. And there's no field of medicine where that's not true, that I can see, no field of clinical medicine. The other part, bringing poor people into the work. I think I'm proud of what we've done in Haiti especially. 70% of the employees of this massive hospital are from Central Haiti. And 70% of the entire workforce of Partners in Health are community health workers, the vast majority of whom have never had a job, any kind of formal job before. And we learn from them in our work all the time, but we also try to transform those conditions with them. So it sounds like sloganeering, you know, in a lot of, even anything I could write, I would feel it might sound that way, or romanticizing what people without a lot of formal training and chances could do, but it's not been our experience. It's been our experience that it improves the quality of care, both by incorporating them as co-workers and colleagues, but also by listening to how they would have us change our care.
And I just want to, sorry, David, I just want to highlight how radical an idea that is in medicine and global health. And that was a real resonance that came through for me in the book with Liberation Theology, this idea that you're trying to subvert a dominant worldview. And that is not easy work, and it gains you a lot of enemies along the way. I want to get to one more question.
Good evening. My name is Mario Melendez. I'm a first-year MD student at Boston University School of Theology. And Dr. Farmer, I'm going to put you on the spot.
Wait, you're from BU?
Yes.
You're not
I know,
allowed
I need
in
to go.
here.
Sanctuary. I'm going to put you on the spot. And Professor, if you want to answer as well. Millions of people, not just around the world, but in this country, have no access to affordable healthcare, to compassionate, decent care. Even after the very good provisions of the Affordable Care Act, access to compassionate, decent care is still a dream. So my question is, among the many things that you see in your analysis coming both from liberation theology, from your work and your work in medicine, what do you think is one of the steps that must be taken to make sure that everyone has access to decent, compassionate, affordable health care?
That's a great question. You know, can I cheat and say two? You'll allow it, Lauren? You know, if you're hit by a car and you need trauma care, right? So I don't want to forget that, or if you have acute leukemia, you need chemotherapy in a hospital, right? One of the biggest problems that we face in the United States and in many of the places we've worked is that we have almost nothing in the way of community-based care, of community health workers. So the model, lessons we learned, back to Harvey Cox's question, the lessons we learned in Haiti and Rwanda, in a place where there were no or very few physicians or nurses in rural Rwanda or rural Haiti, was that community health workers, when they had the right backup, could do the job better. And I wish we had that in the United States. I wish we had that people living with multiple illnesses, elderly or young, had access to more convenient and care near their homes and did not have to go through the difficult process of getting here and there for their fractured care. But if I had to choose one thing, it's going to sound very undramatic, perhaps, but it would be insurance. It would be a safety net. Not a safety net with big gaping holes that gets ripped ever wider in any kind of economic downturn. And you wrote about this in your book, right? Where if there's any recession or problem, the first thing to go out the door is compassionate, expert healthcare that's accessible. And there are exceptions to that, but they're very rare. The United States now, Great Britain, any kind of economic contracture is followed by a contracture of social services for poor people. And that's not just healthcare, it's education, food security, heating security, et cetera. And I'm thinking about the United States, I think, as you can tell. So the idea of universal coverage, or UHC, it's even being called sometime, right? Universal health care is very powerful now in global health circles, more powerful than it is right now here. And I think that's a good thing, because if we in any way sign on to that aspiration to protect people from the effects of catastrophic illness, the economic effects of their personal effects, then we will protect not just millions of people, but probably many hundreds of millions of people. And there will be problems with any insurance system, it is sure, but just that idea of saying you should not have to die because you're poor, or are about to be poor if you're sick and aren't poor but have no insurance. That's the leading cause. Catastrophic illness is the leading cause of destitution in many countries in the world, rich and poor. United States, catastrophic illness is a major cause of impoverishment of American families. So again, I wish I could say something really memorable and jazzy and David-esque. But I think that we need better ways of protecting people from the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. And we might as well call that, better safety nets and better insurance.
David, any thoughts?
Anybody else?
Oh, one more question?
I think there are several
she
more.
would.
I know.
Yeah, line it. Let's get the questions. Yeah.
So I am also a student at Boston University School of Theology, so hang with us here. So my question is, for those of us who are looking at becoming interfaith religious leaders in the next couple of years, going through these programs, what is the most important advice or recommendation that you can give to us who are looking at going out into the world and serving communities to look at these problems?
Well, I think that Gustavo's comment on the first person is really you are and not I am is really about humility, and it's easy to say, right, and far harder to practice, right? I mean, we even celebrate notions as a liberal piety of cultural competence, but it's not a very helpful notion in my experience. The idea that as a graduate student, for example, you could really become culturally competent in a place, you're calling it communities, and I'm not exactly sure which communities you're talking about, but many of the places where I work, I've not found it possible to be culturally competent. But you could have cultural humility. And I think no matter what your field or what your area of study, or if you're in pastoral work, it's all obviously called for, right, much more directly, to be humble and think about doing good in the world, not as some joke that no sophisticated person would attempt, but rather the ultimate goal of your work. I think those are very helpful, if mundane sounding bits of advice. And I got very different advice, but it was complemented by some of the wisdom that I mentioned reading in these books that helped me. And then the idea of some long-term commitment, which we've called accompaniment here. And I suppose there are events and processes where short-term commitments will do, but I just don't see as many of those. Certainly the kind of problems that we've described, whether in a prison in Russia or a squatter settlement in Haiti, require long-term commitments to address effectively, as would food insecurity or a medical system that makes no sense in the United States. Those are long-term commitments. And the other is the one David gave us, is don't think there are lots of things you can learn in a book or in a classroom.
Out of respect for people's time, because we are running over, I'm going to draw this to a close for now and try and move Paul to the back, where he and Jenny, who's also here as a co-author to the book, will sign and happily chat with anyone else who has questions that are ongoing. David, last word, of course. Who am I to stop you?
Don't let him kid you about Jazzy. This man can write beautifully. I don't know if you've seen his book of speeches that he's given, graduation talks. It's a marvelous book, To Heal the World. And some of those chapters are not only entertaining and informative, but they move the reader. And they've moved me sometimes to tears because of the kind of humanity that is coming out of Paul's writing. I just want to lead you one little paragraph that ends the first chapter of the book. It's called The Doctor's Tribute to Gustavo Gutierrez. And I think it's really kind of the heart of what this accompaniment is here. And I think it's an appropriate way to bring my comments to a close, is to give the last word to Paul Farmer. He writes, as long as poverty and inequality persist, as long as people are wounded and imprisoned and despised, we humans will need accompaniment, practical, spiritual, intellectual. It is for this reason, and for many others, that I am grateful for Father Gustavo's presence on this wounded but beautiful earth. That's Paul Farmer.
Thank you, Lauren. Thank you.
Thank you all so much for joining us. On behalf of the Science, Religion, and Culture program at HDS, I bid you good night.